The calendar invite arrived at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday, buried between a dental reminder and a LinkedIn notification from someone selling me productivity courses. I didn't need quarterly strategy session. It read, location, conference room, Epsilon attendees, everyone except me. I stared at the screen until my coffee went cold, watching the names populate like a guest list. To my own professional funeral Jaxon, from product development, who couldn't analyze his way out of a wet paper bag. Riley from marketing, whose idea of market research was scrolling through Twitter polls. Even Peyton, the intern, who still asked me how to convert PDFs to Word documents and whether the company had Wi-Fi on weekends. There was Knox, the department head, whose idea of leadership was forwarding TED Talks about synergy and scheduling alignment meetings where nothing ever aligned. And Ember, the senior analyst, who once plagiarized my risk assessment, then presented it as her own innovative framework during the all-hands meeting, while I sat 3 seats away, watching my intellectual property get applauded by people too busy networking to notice the theft. Everyone was invited. Everyone except the person who'd been quietly holding this department together with spreadsheets and strategic thinking while they played corporate theater with the budget of a community college drama club. I clicked refresh, hoping it was a glitch, hoping someone would remember I existed, hoping basic professional courtesy hadn't completely evaporated, like the respect I once thought I had here. But no, the invite sat there untouched, unedited, a digital middle finger wrapped in Outlook's cheerful blue interface. Knox had CC'd his assistant, Brooke, who probably knew more about our department's actual strategy than he did, which meant this wasn't an oversight. This was intentional, calculated, designed to send a message that I was disposable, forgettable, not worth the courtesy of inclusion in decisions about my own department's future. I screenshot the invite, not because I needed proof, but because sometimes betrayal needs documentation, and revenge requires receipts. And I had a feeling this particular receipt was about to become very expensive for people who thought they could erase me with an email filter. The exclusion stung, but not because I was surprised by it, no. This was the culmination of months of subtle marginalization, the kind that happens gradually, so you almost convince yourself it's not really happening first. They stopped CCing me on emails about strategic decisions. Then my input in meetings got quietly ignored, even when it was the only thing that made sense. Then my project suggestions disappeared into Knox's presentations, like intellectual property laundering, wrapped in middle management mediocrity. I'd been watching my colleagues treat me like furniture, functional, but forgettable, essential, but invisible, until the moment came when they decided I wasn't even essential. The pattern had been building for months, small slights that added up to systematic erasure, like death by 1,000 paper cuts. Except the paper cuts were corporate policies, and the death was professional. I'd started documenting everything, because something about the casual dismissals felt coordinated, like they'd all attended the same workshop on how to marginalize competent employees without creating legal liability. Knox would ask for my analysis, then present it as departmental insights. Ember would interrupt me in meetings, then repeat my exact points. 5 minutes later, to enthusiastic nodding, Riley would schedule brainstorming sessions, then forget to invite the person who actually brainstormed while everyone else just stormed. Hey, if you've ever been the only person excluded from something you should have been included in, smash that subscribe button, because we're about to turn exclusion into ammunition. And I'm gunning for my first 10,000 subscribers who know what it's like to be underestimated by people who couldn't strategize their way out of a conference room with GPS and a map. That night, I sat in my apartment with a bottle of wine that cost more than Knox's monthly contribution to actual strategic thinking, scrolling through the meeting agenda. Someone had accidentally sent to the shared drive, probably Peyton, who still hadn't figured out the difference between reply and reply all, and consistently sent confidential documents to distribution lists that included half the competitor companies in our industry. The agenda was a masterpiece of bureaucratic theater. Item 1, quarterly performance review, which meant sitting around discussing metrics nobody understood. Item 2, resource allocation adjustments, which was corporate, speak for budget cuts, disguised as efficiency, optimization. Item 3, strategic restructuring initiatives, which was code for, we're about to screw someone over and we don't want them in the room when we do it. Item 4, new market opportunities assessment. And there it was buried in agenda. Item 4, like a landmine waiting to explode. My 3 months of work, my comprehensive market analysis, the data-driven insights that could reshape our entire approach to client acquisition, the competitive intelligence, proprietary research, and revenue projections that would make the CFO weep tears of fiscal joy. I'd been developing this analysis since January, when I noticed patterns in our client acquisition data that everyone else had missed while they were busy scheduling synergy workshops and paradigm-shifting coffee chats that accomplish nothing except burning company time and premium coffee beans. I'd been building models, running scenarios, mapping competitive landscapes, and identifying market opportunities that could increase our revenue by double digits, not the kind of incremental improvements that Knox celebrated in his quarterly reports, but actual transformational insights that could reposition us against competitors who'd been eating our lunch for months. I'd mentioned it to Knox twice in our one-on-ones, pitched it during team syncs, even put together a preliminary deck that made our current strategy look like it was designed by caffeinated squirrels running on expired Red Bull and delusions of strategic grandeur. But apparently, my insights weren't worth a seat at the table where decisions were made by people who confused activity with achievement and thought. Strategic planning meant choosing which buzzwords to emphasize. In PowerPoint templates the next morning, I walked into the office like nothing had changed, smiled at the receptionist, grabbed my usual coffee from the machine that perpetually tasted like disappointment and water damage. I didn't ask about the meeting, didn't mention the exclusion, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. Because here's what they didn't know about quiet people. We're not planning our next emotional breakdown. We're planning our next chess move. I spent the morning doing what I always did, actual work, while listening to the post-meeting chatter float over the cubicle walls like toxic gossip mixed with expensive coffee breath. Knox's voice carried the smugness of someone who thought he'd successfully managed a difficult situation, which in his mind probably meant excluding the one person who might ask uncomfortable questions about implementation. Details? Ember laughed at something that probably wasn't funny unless incompetence had suddenly become comedy gold, and Riley mentioned something about aggressive timeline adjustments, which translated to, we're about to dump more work on people who weren't important enough for the meeting, but are somehow essential enough to execute the decisions they weren't allowed to influence. Jaxon walked past my cubicle twice, both times avoiding eye contact like I was radioactive or contagious with whatever disease makes people inconvenient to corporate hierarchies who prefer their strategy sessions free of actual strategic thinking. Peyton, the intern who I'd trained personally on data analysis, looked at me with the guilt of someone who'd been promoted to the inner circle, while their mentor got exiled to Irrelevance Island. Population one competent analyst. The whispers were designed to be heard fragments of conversation about market penetration and competitive positioning and strategic initiatives that sounded suspiciously familiar, like echoes of my own analysis, bouncing back at me through the mouths of people who wouldn't recognize strategic thinking if it came with a PowerPoint template and a corporate buzzword dictionary, complete with pronunciation guides. I could hear Knox explaining concepts he'd clearly memorized from my preliminary deck, using my terminology, my frameworks, my analytical approach, like he'd discovered them during a weekend retreat with his life coach in a stack of Harvard Business Review articles. Then at 10:23 a.m., my phone buzzed, unknown number, with a 212 area code. I let it ring twice before curiosity overtook caution. "Hello, this is Jordan speaking." The voice on the other end was crisp, authoritative, unfamiliar. "Jordan, this is Victoria Chen. I'm calling from the Corporate Strategy Office. I understand you've been working on market analysis for your division." My stomach performed Olympic-level gymnastics. The Corporate Strategy Office was 3 levels above my department's pay grade, the kind of place where decisions got made with billion-dollar implications, where they didn't discuss synergy. They created it, where strategic thinking wasn't a buzzword. It was a requirement. "I've been reviewing department submissions," Victoria continued, "and your preliminary findings came up in our resource optimization discussions. We're particularly interested in your competitive intelligence framework." "I'm sorry," I said slowly, trying to process the impossibility of what I was hearing. "I think there might be some confusion. I wasn't aware any of my work had been submitted to corporate strategy." There was a pause, the kind that carries weight and implications, like a chess player realizing their opponent just moved their queen into perfect position. "Jordan, we received your market analysis report yesterday, submitted by your department head under strategic initiatives. It was quite impressive. We'd like to discuss implementation with you directly." My brain performed the digital equivalent of a Windows blue screen error. Knox had submitted my work, my 3 months of research, my proprietary insights, my revenue projections, without my knowledge, without my permission, without my name anywhere on the cover sheet. He'd stolen my analysis, packaged it as a department initiative, and sent it up the corporate ladder like he was presenting his own strategic brilliance. The audacity was breathtaking. The stupidity was even more impressive, because now corporate strategy wanted to talk implementation details that Knox couldn't possibly understand, much less explain when would be convenient for you to present your findings to the executive committee. Victoria continued, "We're particularly interested in your competitive intelligence framework and the projected ROI calculations, the methodology behind your client. Behavioral mapping is exactly what we've been looking for. To drive our Q4 strategic initiatives." I managed to find my voice somewhere between shock and the dawning realization that cosmic justice was about to be served on a silver platter. Tuesday afternoon would work perfectly. "Victoria, excellent. We'll send a formal meeting request. This is exactly the kind of forward-thinking analysis we need at the strategic level. Your insights about market penetration, particularly the correlation between client acquisition costs and long-term value retention, could reshape how we approach competitive positioning." I hung up and stared at my computer screen for a long time, processing the beautiful irony of what had just happened. Knox, in his infinite arrogance and stunning lack of strategic awareness had submitted my work to people who actually understood strategy, people who could recognize innovation when they saw it, people who would want to discuss implementation details, methodology, competitive analysis, and revenue projections in the kind of depth that requires actual authorship, not theft. The meeting request arrived 30 minutes later. Conference call with the executive committee, Tuesday is 2 p.m. Attendees, myself, Victoria Chen, and 4 other names I recognized from the company directory as people who could fire Knox before he finished his morning latte and still have time to optimize his severance package. The subject line read, Strategic Market Analysis, Implementation, Discussion. Confidential. Please prepare full presentation with methodology and competitive intelligence. Breakdown. I forwarded the invite to my personal email. Then, I did something I'd never done before. In this office, I smiled like a predator who just realized the hunters had walked into their own trap. The weekend became a war room in my apartment. I spread out printouts across my dining table, cross-referenced data sources, verified every statistic, and prepared the kind of presentation that would make Knox's theft impossible to deny. I had timestamps on every file, email trails of every research inquiry, metadata that painted a clearer picture of authorship than a signed confession. I created a presentation that wasn't just about market analysis. It was about demonstrating the strategic thinking that separates actual innovation from corporate theater, the kind of deep analytical work that requires months of development, not the overnight expertise that Knox would claim. If anyone bothered to ask him questions deeper than what font he preferred for PowerPoint Tuesday morning, I arrived at the office carrying a leather portfolio that cost more than Knox's monthly contribution to anything resembling strategic value. Inside were printed copies of every email, every draft, every piece of source material that proved the analysis was mine. Digital breadcrumbs that would lead any reasonable person to the conclusion that Knox was either a thief or the luckiest strategic thinker in corporate history. I'd spent Sunday evening preparing not just the presentation, but the documentation that would expose Knox's intellectual property theft with surgical precision. The kind of evidence that doesn't just prove a point, it buries the opposition. The conference room was empty when I arrived 30 minutes early. As always, I set up my laptop, connected to the projector, and laid out my materials like a general, preparing for a battle they didn't know was coming. When the call connected, Victoria's voice filled the room. Professional, warm, and ready for business. Jordan, thank you for joining us. We're excited to discuss your strategic analysis. This level of competitive intelligence is exactly what we need to drive our market expansion initiatives. I clicked to my first slide. Market Analysis Comprehensive Competitive Intelligence by Jordan. Then, I paused and looked directly at the camera, knowing Knox would eventually watch the recording, knowing he would see his theft exposed in real time to people who could end his career with a phone call. We've identified several key opportunities. I began that could increase market share by 27% within 18 months, based on competitive behavioral analysis, client acquisition pattern mapping, and market penetration modeling that I've been developing over the past quarter. I walked through my findings methodically, each slide building on months of research, competitive analysis, revenue, projections, client acquisition strategies that could transform our market position. The executive committee asked sharp questions, the kind that require deep understanding of methodology, and implications. What's your confidence level in these ROI projections? One voice asked. High, I responded. The modeling is based on 3 different competitive scenarios with sensitivity analysis. For market volatility, we're looking at conservative projections that still deliver significant value. Can you explain the methodology behind your client behavioral mapping? Another voice inquired. Certainly. I developed a framework that correlates acquisition cost with retention probability using historical data from our top 50 clients cross-referenced with competitive pricing analysis and market positioning studies. Knox couldn't have answered a single question because Knox hadn't done the work, hadn't developed the methodology, hadn't spent months building the competitive intelligence framework that made these insights possible. This is impressive work, Victoria said during a brief pause. Your competitive intelligence framework, particularly the client behavioral mapping, shows exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need to scale across multiple divisions. The revenue projections alone could justify significant resource allocation, she continued. We'd like to discuss expanding this analysis. Company-wide, we're talking about a strategic initiative that could reshape our entire market approach. Your insights about competitive positioning could inform our acquisition strategy, our product development roadmap, and our client retention programs. This isn't just departmental analysis. This is enterprise-level strategic thinking. The call ended with promises of follow-up meetings, resource discussions, and the kind of executive attention that transforms careers. I closed my laptop and sat in the empty conference room, savoring the silence that comes after victory. Knox had no idea what was coming for him, but he was about to learn that theft only works when you understand what you're stealing. The email from Victoria arrived 2 hours later, marked high priority with the red exclamation point that makes executives pay attention. The executive committee was recommending my market analysis for immediate implementation. They wanted to schedule a full presentation for the board of directors. They were discussing promotion opportunities, strategic leadership roles, and resource allocation that would give me more budget than Knox's entire department. They were treating me like someone whose insights mattered, because they did. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. Knox had tried to steal credit for my work and accidentally promoted me to the executives who could recognize real strategic thinking. I was about to become untouchable, while he remained exactly what he'd always been, a middle manager who confused titles with talent, who thought leadership meant forwarding motivational quotes and scheduling alignment meetings. But I wasn't done yet, because exclusion teaches you patience, and patience is the sharpest weapon in the arsenal of the underestimated. At 3:15 p.m., I walked past Knox's office. He was on a call, gesturing wildly at his monitor, probably trying to explain strategic concepts he didn't understand. To people who did, I could hear fragments through the door: implementation timeline, and resource allocation, and competitive positioning, all phrases lifted directly from my analysis, like he was reading from a script he didn't write. I knocked once and entered when he waved me in. He was talking to someone about market penetration strategies, using my terminology, my frameworks, my strategic insights, like he'd invented them himself during a weekend retreat with his motivational speaking coach. I waited until he hung up. Then I sat down across from his desk with the calm of someone holding a royal flush in a poker game, where everyone else was bluffing with business cards and corporate buzzwords. Knox looked flustered, his usual confidence replaced by the sweaty desperation of someone who just realized he was performing surgery with a butter knife. Jordan, good timing. I was just discussing the department's market analysis with corporate strategy. Some exciting developments, he said, trying to sound casual, while his voice cracked like a teenager asking someone to prom. Great news, I replied, savoring every syllable. I just finished presenting the full analysis to the executive committee. They want to implement it company-wide. Knox's face cycled through confusion, panic, and something approaching the nausea that comes with realizing you've accidentally swallowed your own poison. You presented to the executive committee, he squeaked, like a mouse who just realized the cat was bigger than expected. They called me directly, I said, enjoying every word. Apparently, when you submitted my work to corporate strategy, they were impressed enough to want to discuss it with the actual author. Knox opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, like a malfunctioning ventriloquist dummy whose puppeteer had suddenly developed Parkinson's. The actual author, he repeated slowly, like he was trying to translate a foreign language. Yes, Knox, the person who spent 3 months researching competitive intelligence, mapping, client behaviors, developing revenue projections, and creating the strategic framework, while you were forwarding articles about paradigm shifts and scheduling synergy workshops. His face went white, then red, then something approaching the green of someone who just realized they'd been eating expired sushi. I have all the source files. I continued twisting the knife with the precision of a surgeon who'd been planning this operation for months. All the research notes, all the email trails that show the development process. Corporate strategy wants to see the full methodology behind the analysis. They want to understand how I developed the competitive intelligence framework. The silence stretched between us like a tightrope over an abyss of professional humiliation. Knox knew he couldn't explain work he hadn't done, couldn't defend insights he hadn't developed, couldn't implement strategies he didn't understand, couldn't answer questions about methodology he'd never learned. They're considering this for board presentation. I added each word, a nail in the coffin of his credibility. Strategic leadership opportunities, significant resource allocation, the kind of recognition that comes with actual strategic thinking, not the kind that comes with stealing other people's work and hoping nobody notices. Knox swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a cork. In troubled water, Jordan. I think there might be some confusion about attribution. The analysis was a team effort, department, collaboration. You know how these strategic initiatives develop organically. I smiled, the kind of smile that cuts glass and careers. Knox, I have timestamps on every file, email, trails of every research inquiry, documentation of every source I consulted. This wasn't a team effort. This was my work that you submitted without permission, without attribution, and definitely without understanding. The room went quiet, except for the hum of his desktop computer and the sound of his career aspirations, deflating like a punctured balloon at a children's party. They want me to lead the implementation, I said, standing up. They're talking about promotion to strategic level. They see this as the foundation for company-wide transformation, and they want someone who actually understands the work to oversee it, someone who can explain the methodology, defend the projections, and develop the framework. Further, I walked to the door, then turned back. One more thing, Knox. They mentioned how impressed they were that I'd developed this analysis while maintaining my regular workload, showing initiative and strategic thinking, beyond my current role, which makes me wonder why someone with that kind of value wasn't included in quarterly strategy meetings. I left him, sitting there staring at his monitor like it might spontaneously generate the strategic insights he'd never possessed, watching him realize that his attempt to steal credit had actually exposed his own incompetence, was better than any performance review, any raise, any promotion could ever be. The board presentation happened. The following Thursday, Conference Room Alpha, the one with the mahogany table, and the intimidating portraits of executives who'd built the company from nothing. I arrived early, set up my materials, and reviewed my notes one final time. This wasn't just a presentation, it was vindication. The board members filed in gray-haired, serious-faced people who'd seen every corporate maneuver and strategic blunder imaginable. They had the kind of collective experience that could smell incompetence from 3 floors away and recognize strategic thinking. From the first slide, Victoria introduced me as the strategic analyst behind the market analysis initiative that corporate strategy was recommending for immediate implementation. I clicked to my opening slide and began the presentation I'd been unconsciously preparing for months. Market penetration analysis, client acquisition strategies, competitive positioning that could increase revenue by 31% within 2 years. The board asked questions. I answered them, asked for clarification. I provided. It asked for implementation, timelines. I had them asked about competitive risks. I'd modeled for them, asked about resource requirements. I'd calculated them. The chairman, a silver-haired woman whose reputation for strategic brilliance preceded her by decades, leaned forward. This is exactly the kind of forward-thinking analysis we need. Your competitive intelligence framework shows depth of understanding that we rarely see. At the departmental level, how quickly can we begin implementation? My confidence steadied, transformed into something sharper. I've already begun preliminary client outreach based on the competitive intelligence framework. We could have pilot programs running within 6 weeks, full implementation across 3 divisions within the quarter. The room buzzed with the energy that accompanies real strategic opportunity, the kind of ideas that transform companies rather than just rearranging organizational charts. They voted unanimously to implement the analysis company-wide. They allocated resources that made my previous budget look like lunch money. They offered me a promotion to senior strategic analyst, reporting directly to corporate strategy. They gave me everything Knox had tried to steal through exclusion and theft. As I packed up my materials, the chairman approached me personally. "Strategic thinking like this doesn't go unnoticed," she said. "We've been looking for someone who can bridge tactical analysis with strategic implementation. This analysis demonstrates exactly that capability." I nodded, trying to project professional calm while internally celebrating the complete reversal of power dynamics. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said. "I believe strategic analysis should inform decision-making, not just support decisions that have already been made." She smiled, the kind of smile that opens doors. "You'll fit in well at the strategic level. We need people who understand that data without insight is just noise, and insight without implementation is just academic exercise." That evening, I walked past Knox's office one final time. He was still there, probably trying to figure out how to explain his sudden irrelevance to a wife who thought he was climbing the corporate ladder instead of falling off it. He looked up as I passed, his expression a mixture of defeat and dawning understanding that theft only works when you understand what you're stealing. I didn't say anything, didn't gloat, didn't rub salt in wounds that were entirely self-inflicted. I just smiled, the smile of someone who'd transformed exclusion into elevation, betrayal into breakthrough. The best revenge isn't anger. It's success that exposes the incompetence that tried to contain you Monday morning, brought a new office 3 floors higher, a window with actual sunlight, and a title that reflected my strategic value. Knox remained in his old office, with his old title, and his new understanding that strategic thinking can't be stolen, only exposed. My calendar was full of implementation meetings, strategic planning sessions, board updates, and the kind of responsibilities that come with being recognized for actual contribution rather than corporate theater. And every time I walked past conference room, Epsilon, where they still held their quarterly strategy sessions, without any real strategy, I remembered that sometimes the most powerful weapon against exclusion isn't inclusion. It's making them realize what they excluded. Thanks for watching you. Strategic Legends, hit that subscribe button. Unless you're the person who tried to steal credit for someone else's work, then you're already subscribed to failure.